Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Stephanie Powers at the Council on Foundations, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on the topic of opportunity zones. Can foundations help communities get ready? I'm the Vice President for Policy and Partnerships at the Council, and in the room with me are two of my colleagues that will be assisting with the webinar. Peter Gordon, who is our Associate Director of Government Relations, and Kelsey Gerber, who is our associate in our professional development department, who is our logistics guru for our webinar, and she'll be helping us with the Q&A part of the webinar, and she will tell us she will tell you how to ask questions in just a minute. So this is an offering by the Council's Public Policy and Government Relations Office and part of our ongoing Inclusive Economic Opportunity Learning Series. Just by way of a little background, in May and August, we hosted convenings with regional philanthropy in the South and the Midwest to examine the role of foundations in an innovation-based economy. In these meetings, attendees expressed interest in learning more about the implications of the new tax provision called Opportunity Zones. At the time, we didn't have a lot of information as the guidance from Treasury had not been issued. So here we are today to discuss the recently released guidance, which has just been issued, who the important stakeholders are in states, and the potential roles for foundations in Opportunity Zone projects that materialize. Before we dive in, I would like to ask Peter just to update us very quickly on the status of the process of the regulations. Peter?
Thank you, Stephanie. As Stephanie mentioned, Treasury and IRS released regulations on opportunity zones, and that was done on October 19th. There was a comment period for that, which ends December 18th. And as part of the first set of proposed regulations, Treasury and IRS let us know that there's likely to be another set of regulations that should be released before the end of the year. Regarding these regulations, one of our panelists will talk about those a little bit more in depth in a little bit.
Great, and in just a minute there will be a slide with those dates on it that Peter just mentioned. Also, we should tell you there will be a link to the recording of the webinar, and slides will be sent to all registrants and will be available to COF members on an ongoing basis in our webinar archives, part of our website. So I'd like Kelsey to just take a second here to talk to us about how you in the audience can ask questions today.
Hi everyone, great to have you on. So we're trying something new with questions today. So we're going to try to allow you all to raise your hands if you have a question, and we will at that time unmute you. So we'll call your name as it is listed on the screen, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your questions to the panelists out loud. If we end up having a large number of questions, or if you feel like you want to make sure your question gets recorded for us to follow up on later, ask your question in the questions box on your control bar, and the hand raising icon is also on your control bar. So we are going to aim to do that, and again, make sure if you have any other questions, any questions that you want us to follow up on later, feel free to type them in the questions box.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. I should tell everybody that there are about 200 people on this webinar, so it's a large group. I know there are a lot of questions, and we just have a limited amount of time. I think we are also very open to doing continuation webinars and phone calls to help us all understand how to engage in these opportunity zones as it all materializes. So here is our agenda for today on the screen. We're going to talk about the Treasury rules. We're going to talk about investors and the type of projects. We're going to talk a bit about state strategies and what the governors are thinking, and also examples of communities and some of the approaches. Next slide, if you would, Kelsey. This is the slide that Peter just mentioned with all of the dates on it. Go ahead, you can push me ahead again. So our speakers today, I'd like to thank our guest panelists for being with us. We thought today it would be good for everybody to really understand how these Treasury rules relate to foundation interests, in addition to understanding timelines and stakeholders. We also wanted to understand what some of the various perspectives about some of the outcomes are for these impacted communities and how governors are thinking about this and how to connect with state strategies. So we are grateful for our speakers who represent all of these perspectives today for being with us. Oh, I guess I should be looking here. I can't see the screen. So I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. Don Snyder, who is a tax associate with the Federal Policy Group. Aaron Klein, who is Fellow and Policy Director on Regulation of Markets at the Brookings Institution. Sally Rode, who is the Senior Policy Analysis at Economic Policy of the National Governors Association. Tim Blute, who is the Director of an office called NGA Future at the National Governors Association. Aaron Seibert, who is a Social Investment Officer at the Kresge Foundation and is filling in for Kimberly Cornett, who was unable to join at the last minute. Adam Northup, who is with Locust Impact Investing, and Rachel Riley, who is the Director of Impact Investing at Enterprise Community Partners. I'm going to turn to Don Snyder first, who is the Council's Government Relations Consultant from the Federal Policy Group, to get us started. So the Treasury rules were finally published. Don, what do we need to know, and what are the salient highlights that foundations should understand?
Thanks, Stephanie. So let me take you through those issues. In order to get settled on the regulations, it's helpful to understand first, sorry, we had some issues here with the slides. Can we back? Okay, here we go. It's really helpful to understand first the basic provision. So this was a provision, this opportunity zone provision was enacted as part of the tax reform that was passed in December of 2017. At its core, this provision centers around this concept of low-income communities. There are a lot of rules in the code provision itself with respect to these low-income communities. Some of them are described in this slide. What's important to understand as partners looking to participate in this process is that the low-income communities that are eligible to be qualified opportunity zones at this point are already determined. Furthermore, the qualified opportunity zones themselves are also already determined. So there's a reference there to an IRS notice 2018-48. That notice contains a list, literally a census tract by census tract list of all of the eligible qualified opportunity zones. And unless or until Congress were to change the provision or extend the provision somehow, there won't be any new qualified opportunity zones. So let's just sort of use that as a level set. Let's try next slide here. All right, so low-income communities can become qualified opportunity zones. Investments in a qualified opportunity zone through something called a qualified opportunity fund are provided special tax treatment. The idea is to incentivize investment in these low-income communities through designating qualified opportunity zones and having qualified opportunity funds invest in the qualified opportunity zone. Every qualified opportunity fund is required to meet this 90% test, which says that 90% of the qualified opportunity zones, at least 90% of the qualified opportunity fund assets are invested in qualified opportunity zone property. The universe of property that a qualified opportunity fund can invest in is actually pretty circumscribed by the code provision. Basically, they can invest in two types of things. They can invest in businesses in the qualified opportunity zone called qualified opportunity zone businesses, or they can invest directly in property in a qualified opportunity zone. And that doesn't have to be real property, but practically speaking, it could sort of play out by that. For persons who reinvest capital gain in a qualified opportunity fund, there's a number of different benefits that the code provision provides. The first benefit is that the gain that is reinvested is eligible to be deferred. So in other words, let's say someone had $1,000 of capital gain and they want to reinvest that in a qualified opportunity fund. By reinvesting that $1,000 in the qualified opportunity fund, the person who reinvested in the qualified opportunity fund doesn't have to pay tax for up to 10 years. In addition, depending on how long the person holds his or her or its investment in the qualified opportunity fund, the gain that was reinvested is in part exempt from taxation, either 10% if it's held for 5 years or more, or 15% if it's held for 7 or more years. The last benefit is that the gain inside of the qualified opportunity fund itself can be 100% exempt from tax to the extent that the qualified opportunity fund investment is held for a sufficient period, 10 years at least. The regulations that were issued by Treasury are highly, highly technical, and the focus of the regulations really is on the qualified opportunity funds and the investors who invest in the qualified opportunity funds. So given the fact that this is a highly technical provision and highly technical regulations, clearly Treasury tries its best to answer every question, but not every question is answered by these regulations. In fact, some of I won't go through the entire list, but there's a number of issues that were addressed in the proposed regulations. But as you will see, there are also a number of issues that were reserved for future guidance, right? So that's that first bullet in the set of sub-bullets. Furthermore, relevant to the sector, there are some issues that just aren't addressed in the regulations at all, and they aren't even directly identified as needing to be addressed, such as, for example, any social value metric for evaluating a qualified opportunity fund's investment in a qualified opportunity zone. In part, this is not entirely surprising given that the statute doesn't have specifically any requirement for this type of a metric, but I flag that because I think that it might be important to this sector. So let's talk a little bit very quickly about some of the rules that are in this batch of proposed regulations. And before I do that, I actually need to take a quick step back. The proposed regulations specifically identify that there will be additional guidance coming out. So this will be the first in a series of at least 2 proposed regulations on the topic. I won't focus on these provisions here. Let's talk about this one. The proposed regulations have a rule on how long one can hold a qualified opportunity fund investment and still receive the 100% exemption with respect to any gain from selling the investment. So the last date, the rules say that the last date to exit out of a qualified opportunity fund and receive the 100% exemption is December 31st, 2047. Now, this rule does follow, in general, the very technical mechanics of the code provision and the regulations, but it actually gives investors, specifically mentions as giving as investors as receiving an additional 10 years to exit out of their qualified opportunity fund investment and still receive their 100% exemption. The reasoning that Treasury gave for this provision was to be the least disruptive as possible in allowing investors to come into a qualified opportunity fund and come out of a qualified opportunity fund without having to do fire sales or forcing the sale of investments that were being productive. All right. One thing to note in this slide right here is there is specifically a rule that a qualified opportunity fund does not necessarily need to be a newly created fund. So Treasury helpfully clarified that point. Presumably, though, the way the rules work, an investment in the qualified opportunity fund would have to be new because the code mechanics require an election to be made in order for the investment to qualify for all the special tax benefits. There's a rule in the proposed regulations dealing with how a qualified opportunity zone business treats the cash that it has on hand for purposes of meeting the various asset tests that it must meet in order to be a qualified opportunity zone business. Specifically, the rule says that so long as the business has a plan to invest cash on hand, generally follows this written plan to invest the cash on hand, it can take up to 31 months to put the cash on hand into actual investment in qualified opportunity zone assets. And the reasoning behind this was that certain projects tend to take a long time to get off the ground. And so if Treasury was to have a very mechanical short-term rule with respect to how quickly a business needed to utilize the funds, it might take certain projects off the table. And so this rule is very helpful in that respect. In addition, let me talk just a little bit about what has come to be known as the so-called 70-30 rule. The 70-30 rule explains that a qualified opportunity zone business has substantially all of its property, and that's a legal term of art, as qualified opportunity zone property, so long as at least 70% of its property is qualified opportunity zone property. And so I realize that's a lot of legal jargon. The qualified opportunity zone business has to have substantially all of its property inside of the qualified opportunity zone. That's actually in the code provision itself. What the proposed regulation does is it interprets that phrase substantially all. And substantially all is a nebulous concept. It doesn't mean the same thing everywhere that it's used in the Internal Revenue Code or in the Treasury regulations. And so for this purpose, for the purpose of this provision, Treasury has said, okay, well, we mean substantially all to mean 70%. So that would mean, for example, that if there was a business, let's say it's a restaurant business, and it has 4 different restaurants, as long as 3 of the restaurants, presumably every restaurant is worth the same, so long as 3 of those restaurants are in the qualified opportunity zone, then 75% of its property is in the qualified opportunity zone, which would be in excess of the 70% threshold, and it would be able to consider itself as a qualified opportunity zone business. As I mentioned previously, these rules are highly technical. I expect that there may be questions individuals would have with respect to the rules, with respect to what is done and what is not done. Rather than spend a great deal of time talking about a lot of minutia, I wanted to give you just an overview and a flavor, but I am definitely open to any questions anyone might have now. And in addition, my contact information is listed if you come up with a question, but it's just not at the sort of tip of your tongue right now.
Thanks very much, Don. So, question that I have is, who actually would be poring through these very technical regulations? Are they the advisors to investors? Are they financial institutions? And should foundations, should we be like poring through those regulations? They sound like they're really designed for the investor group.
Yeah, that's right, Stephanie. So these regulations are really focused on questions that the persons who form qualified opportunity funds would have, and the persons who invest in a qualified opportunity fund would have. And I don't expect that many of the participants on this call would be interested in making an investment in a qualified opportunity fund more that they would be wishing to partner with qualified opportunity funds. So the persons who are going to be pouring through these regulations are obviously the banks and various funds and their advisors who who either have qualified opportunity funds in existence or would be interested in creating them. And in addition, the persons who represent individuals who might want to invest in qualified opportunity funds. And I expect that the next set of regulations will also be mostly focused on issues that relate to things that these groups care about. I would flag, though, again, that to the extent that participants in this sector would like Treasury to do more or less with respect to how these rules are crafted, this would be one of their opportunity points to be able to voice their views on such a matter. So while the rules don't really directly relate to anyone in this sector, speaking of people on this call, it may be worth, if you have strong views as to how this provision should be designed, it may be worth your time to at least look through the rules and find ones that you would like to comment on. I tried to list some of the big ones that are there, but obviously, again, they're very technical, so there's a number of different rules.
Great, thank you. We did have time for one question. We do have somebody in the audience. Stephen Adams had his hand raised. We're going to unmute you, Stephen. Could you very succinctly ask your question?
Great, thanks. This may be more technical than you're ready to respond to, but I wonder if the rules indicate that the investments in the actual activity have to be equity investments, or is there an opportunity to do debt investment?
Stephen, I can actually address that for you. The investments in businesses must be equity investments. So the Treasury regulation is clear on this point. This was actually an issue of uncertainty following the enactment of the code provision, but Treasury in its proposed rules clarifies that only equity interests in corporations or equity interests in partnerships count for purposes of these rules. So that does leave open things like perhaps preferred equity, which may have some debt-like component to it, but it closes off things such as pure debt and potentially even convertible debt.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We are going to push on. I'd just like to make a couple of comments about the sound. We've had some people send us notes about the sound. Prior to signing on today, we had a little problems with our, what I call our space phone here in the conference room. We had to switch it out. So we might sound like we're in like a room, because we're in our conference room, so it might be a little bit of an echo. But hopefully you can hear us at least clearly. I'm going to, any other questions that you might have for Don of a technical nature, please feel free to send us an email, and we will have, or put in the chat box, or you can, for COF members, you can contact Peter or myself directly afterwards as well. So let's move on now, and I'd like to introduce Aaron Klein, who is at the Brookings Institution, and Aaron is a fellow in economic studies and serves as the policy director there at the Center on Regulation and Markets. And so he focuses on financial regulation and technology and infrastructure finance and policy. And I had asked Aaron if he could give us some perspectives from his perspective, what kinds of investors are likely to be involved? How do foundations kind of fit into this space? He and I have been talking over the summer about the potential role of foundations, and I know he's been putting some thought into that. So Aaron, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank everybody for joining. What I want to try and do here is walk through a little more from a policy perspective and a public interest perspective, what we know about the program and what we don't know about the program, and then transition into how foundations can help collect information about what we don't know and disseminate ideas and potentially engage to both track the successes and failures of opportunity zones, as well as determine what best practices are and promote them. So if could go to the next slide. So what we know, this is an extremely large program. We have no idea how large because CBO estimates of these are slightly irrelevant based on actual take-up. And what we know is the regulations are moving very quickly and are as investor-friendly as conceivably possible, right? You have a situation where people can be selling capital gains now, wait 6 months to declare to create an opportunity fund, then wait 31 months to actually invest the funds. So that's over a 3-year delay between the sale of the capital gain and the allocation of the funds. So in terms of impact and actual investment, you could see a substantial lag of activity going on. This provides an opportunity strategically for foundations and research to promote better practices and activities and get ahead of the curve, because a lot of these investments will be in physical infrastructure, buildings. Some of them will be in businesses, but they'll be mostly equity investments in communities. What we know is that states had basically unfettered discretion in designating opportunity zones. They had a requirement to move very quickly. They acted with little coordination to relevant stakeholders, both at the sub-state municipal level and at the broader investment strategic objective level. And that there's no real evaluations required. In fact, due to self-certification, there's going to be a long gap between until the public knows how large opportunity funds are, how many investors are out there, what the size or magnitude of this market is. And this can go on for quite a long time, given the lengthy period of potential investment. The types of investors that are going to take advantage of this. Well, you're going to start with kind of serial property investors, or anybody with large existing capital gains, particularly even though the stock market has corrected sharply in the interim period, it's still up significantly. So what you'll see is some natural investment churning that normally takes place where people sell gains and reinvest into other assets. They'll now be very interested in reinvesting into predominantly real estate and opportunity zone funds, or businesses expanding in opportunity zone funds. You're going to see funds forming for this. I think you're going to see a lot of property development eager to engage in buildings, and some speculators buying up space and waiting on it, trying to sell to potential funds. I don't think there's going to be a dearth of investable properties given the large amounts of designation of opportunity zones in the market. I do think eventually you'll see, at first it will be extremely wealthy people. Institutional investors, pension funds, etc., will be blocked out because the tax benefits don't accrue to them anyways. The mass affluent folks, I think, will eventually get into it, but it will take a little while because of liquidity concerns of the actual opportunity zone fund. There'll be some financial engineering that goes into figuring out how to create more liquid instruments, particularly and more diversified. So from the investor strategy, the two biggest potential impediments to investing in these funds are both liquidity and diversity. I think you'll try to find some folks that try to do them in city specific and others that may go national. The states, which strategies the states are pursuing, I think is put a little bit kindly. I think a lot of states aren't pursuing strategies. I think the dominant outcome, the modal outcome, will be a very laissez-faire. States designated some things, private money went in random places. Much of it was inframarginal, as economists would say. These developments were already on the books. They just got windfalls. Some states and some localities will try to aggressively fund programs. And this is an area where I think foundations have a tremendous opportunity to play a role. There is little coordination. There's a tremendous opportunity for coordination, let me try to be positive, with changing local zoning, integrating local infrastructure and housing plans correlated with opportunity zones. So opportunity zones are created and defined now in census tracts. They, for the most part, weren't done in a coordinated fashion with state infrastructure plans or county or regional local plans. And you're going to have huge tax incentives to develop one area and yet an infrastructure plan that calls for building out a different area. I think foundations could provide a lot of assistance, and research could provide a lot of assistance in helping localities integrate that. Even within an opportunity zone fund, these are can be large geographic areas of land. Where will the locality choose to relax zoning or other requirements that will allow for the level of property and real capital investment required by these large potential investors? I think the question of who will benefit, the provision and the IRS guidance so far is looking primarily at maximizing the investor's benefit. So people who are investing in this are predominantly multimillionaires. That's the people who have large capital gains, corporations that are trying to seek some level of tax cuts, limited liabilities partnerships, REITs, etc. These are predominantly large corporations or extremely affluent people, right? Trying to maximize their tax windfall it seems to be the goal of the Treasury Department. There's no other federal policy player. States, localities, foundations, communities, and nonprofits are going to be the ones that need to look at whether the benefits of this investment flows to the communities and the individuals in those communities. So defining benchmarks beyond just number of buildings and constructs, defining marginal improvements as a question of whether or not these tax property gains simply are windfall to investors. And so the definition and metrics of success, I think there's a huge role for foundations to play in tracking this data, reporting this data, creating some level of competition among states to provide benefits to their constituents instead of investors, many of whom are out of state, since these aren't really necessarily aligned with state tax incentives. From my experience as a policymaker, states will compete for a high ranking. States will be embarrassed and move if they have a low ranking. But when they're not ranked amongst each other, nobody's really that terribly responsive. In addition, creating best practices and disseminating information about localities, communities, case studies that have used this opportunity zone effectively. Per the guidance, people will be able to elect and make these investments for many years to come. So I don't think people should think of this as a one-time situation. In point of fact, this is an ongoing experiment as long as this tax law is not modified. And these funds can take quite a long time to deploy. So, given this 31-month window that we now know. So in conclusion, to summarize, I think foundations can play an extremely important role in promoting coordination among localities, thinking about and promoting integration between this private investment that will be generated by opportunity zones and public infrastructure investment that will be necessary to optimize that value, tracking and measuring and defining success for key constituencies, the underserved marginal communities, and providing and publicizing information, both in terms of best practices and in terms of data for success stories and, frankly, for failures.
Aaron, I wanted to ask you this question. So you mentioned zoning regulations. You're talking about tracking, measuring, defining success for populations that live in these zones and for these communities. So it sounds like there might be some sense in foundations really working together with their mayors or their local elected officials in kind of maybe planning these things or at least discussing some of these suggestions that you've made. So I'm thinking about the local municipal officials, even though there's no defined role for them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the local municipal officials are kind of at one level completely powerless and at another level potentially highly powerful. So they're powerless in the sense that the states define the districts with no consultation requirement to them. However, most of the zoning and land use requirements that may be necessary to unlock this space is in their hands. Some of the infrastructure decisions will be in their hands, some will be in the state's hands, some might be in third-party infrastructure operators' hands. But you know, absent a coordinated strategic perspective that I think foundations can help to bring, what you'll try to probably find are idiosyncratic property developers who have idiosyncratic objectives or areas that they want to invest in for a variety of reasons within these zones, trying to curry favor with local elected officials the kind of traditional way. You know, political contributions, you know, small community area, potential ancillary investments, without thinking of some broader strategic objective. And I think foundations could play a large educational role for local elected official leaders, and as well a large intellectual role in trying to show local elected officials what tools they have under their control to help guide some of this investment. If I were a local elected official, part of this would feel very disempowering. The state designated which census tracts, the Treasury Department designates what type of investment, and there's no consultation role for me. When in point of fact, you control the land use requirements, you control measures of infrastructure service, you know, you sometimes have the ability or authority to require within development affordable housing set-asides, public use benefits, et cetera, and so forth. So for many of these projects that will require some sort of substantial land improvement, which is one of the regulatory requirements to have the property qualify, right? You can't just speculate in an opportunity zone fund. You have to have made an improvement. Most of these improvements will require some level of permitting or zoning by the locality. Permitting almost all, zoning many.
Right. Yeah, I think those are really helpful insights. We have one hand raised, and it's Stephen Adams. Stephen, your question, please.
Sure. This might be for another speaker. I don't know, but it occurred to me that the other thing that foundations can do is, wouldn't this tax rule make it a lot more attractive to do PRIs that may not have been plausible under in the absence of these tax breaks and the tax shelter?
Yeah.
So,
Actually, Aaron, do you want to take a crack at that? Because I think that our panelists at the end probably can also take a crack at that question. But go ahead, Aaron.
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to defer to that in the sense that to the extent that there are private investors who are willing to, who pay the tax, this would make it much more advantageous for them to invest in an opportunity zone. To the extent that you're a public entity that doesn't pay taxes, it has no impact. However, don't think that there's going to be a scarcity of these types of places. I mean, up to a quarter, you know, large numbers of tracts designated as opportunity funds and opportunity zones. So if you're in these state designated areas, yes, there is a large incentive, but it also has to be coming from profits that have recently been realized. So in order to benefit from these incentives, you have to be simultaneously selling an existing capital gain.
Great, thank you very much. And Adam Seibert did ping us to say that he could also address that issue a little bit later on when he speaks. Eric, sorry, from Kresge Foundation, right? Okay, we're going to move on now to states, and Sally Rood and Tim Blute are going to share some insights into how governors are approaching this and what observations that they have thus far. So Sally and Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon. I'm Sally Rood from the National Governors Association, where I'm responsible for the Economic Development Program in the NGA Center for Best Practices. We appreciate the opportunity to have this time with you today with the Council's members on this topic, because we feel that in order to meet the spirit of the Opportunity Zones legislation, it'll be very important for states and their resident foundations around the country to work together to make sure that the disadvantaged residents in each state's Opportunity Zones are central to that state's Opportunity Zone strategies. So I'm going to provide an overview of NGA's activities related to Opportunity Zones up to this point, and then we'll talk about what states have been doing so far, and we'll also talk about the activities we have planned for the near future. We're advancing the slide, thanks. We think we're advancing the slide. Well, advance it some more. Yay. So after the legislation was passed in December, the NGA Office of Government Relations organized briefings for governors' offices and in governors' Washington representatives. And the Office of Government Relations office, as you know, works with Congress on pending legislation, and they work with federal agency on pending regulations. So it's important to remind everybody at this point that NGA is a bipartisan organization, and we represent all governors, Republicans and Democrats, in their states. The Office of Government Relations at NGA is organized according to issue areas. For example, the Economic Development and Commerce Committee, which has been spearheading Opportunity Zones so far, has 12 members, 7 Republican governors, and 5 governors who are Democrats. And the committee is chaired by New Jersey Governor Murphy, a Democrat, and co-chaired by Arizona Governor Ducey, who's a Republican. So as I mentioned earlier this year, the Office of Government Relations went to work organizing briefings with guest speakers to help governors and their advisors understand how they could designate their zones. They brought in experts such as John Lettieri and Steve Glickman from EIG, Bruce Katz and Sarah Bianchi from the Governance Project. And at the NGA summer meeting in Santa Fe, the Office of Government Relations organized a governors-only session on Opportunity Zones. It featured experts from the philanthropic community, the capital community, the federal sector. And at that meeting, governors stated their commitment to continue to move forward on developing state strategies for their Opportunity Zones. So our Economic Development and Commerce Committee in the Office of Government Relations is now analyzing the draft regulations that came out on the 19th, and they're seeking input from governors and their staff. So we've also been sharing information through the NGA Center for Best Practices. The NGA Center is comprised of 5 divisions, including the Economic Opportunity Division, which focuses on inclusive economic prosperity, entrepreneurship, small business growth, community development and housing, post-secondary education, and workforce development. And the Environment, Energy, and Transportation Division, or EET, which is interested in infrastructure enhancements such as wastewater facilities, and the Division of Homeland Security and Public Safety, which, along with the EET division, is focused on the possibility for creating greater infrastructure resiliency. So the center's divisions mirror the Office of Government Relations committees, And for example, I'm in the NGA Center, and I staff the governor's economic policy advisors who are in the governor's offices, or our governor-appointed cabinet-level positions such as secretaries of commerce or a governor's office of trade. And my division, the Economic Opportunity Division, also encompasses the governor's human services advisors, and they handle children and family issues such as income support, housing stability, and other supports to low-income individuals and families. And I have with me here on this call today Alexander Cawthorn Gaines, who staffs those advisors, so that when we get to the Q&A, Alex can assist in addressing any relevant questions. The NGA Center runs NGA's peer learning meetings, such as institutes, and its technical assistance projects, such as multi-year policy academies and cohorts of states, and multi-state learning lab projects, and a range of issue areas. So before I talk about what the states have been doing in this area, I'd like to briefly mention a subject that's on everyone's mind this fall as we approach next week, and that is the upcoming elections. The elections next week will feature 39 races for governors, mostly due to term limits. We already know that there will be new governors in at least 18 states or territories for sure. And the other 21 states and territories, incumbents are running for re-election, and there may or may not be a turnover at the governor's level. Either way, we'll have a record number of new governors following the elections this fall. Another office at NGA, the NGA Office of Management Consulting and Training, holds a seminar for new governors following every election. And the seminar for new governors this year will take place in Colorado, and we anticipate that it'll be a very high-profile seminar given the large number of new governors coming into office. All of the NGA offices will have a new constituency to meet and work with and support in the coming years. And given this context, I think it's obvious how the timing will be good to begin working with new state administrations this coming spring once those new governors are in place. So what have states been doing so far to prepare for their opportunity zones? This slide lists some categories of activities that we've identified out in the states. And I'm not presenting them in any particular order, but just to read off some examples. States have been identifying their assets and their needs to establish an overall state strategy. They've been engaging community leaders and coordinating with housing authorities. They've been identifying other potential projects, initiatives, and target audiences within their state strategies. They've been aligning with philanthropic and nonprofit communities for collective impact in their zones. They've been building their state knowledge base and partnerships to get funds stood up and exploring the potential for state-operated funds. They've been marketing their sites and resident small businesses and reaching out to external fund managers. They've been strategically layering investment incentives, such as, for example, with the Historic Preservation Tax Credits program. They've been providing an online presence and acting as a state-level clearinghouse for opportunities and activity. And they've been organizing state summits and workshops to bring together their state's key stakeholders who should be involved in this area with them. So to talk about how we plan to move forward at NGA, I'd like to introduce my colleague Tim Blue, who's the director of NGA Future.
Thank you, Sally. So far, we're going to go to the next slide. So far, we've seen that certain states have been especially active in this area, and a portion of the states that are gearing up to get more active. We expect this to rev up soon after the upcoming elections when the new governors take office. In those states that are getting organized, they're assessing what information they need to move forward. At a base level, we feel that all states need guidance on basics such as how opportunity zones function, the various roles that governors can play, how they can balance state and local concerns, how to integrate opportunity zones into the state's existing broader strategies, such as inclusive economic growth, community development, and workforce development, identifying ways to align fund investments with states' broad goals for infrastructure and resiliency, and perhaps most importantly, how to identify and align with interested stakeholders. And this includes foundations, because we see the philanthropic community as a key player in helping to ensure that disadvantaged and underserved communities are the target for these efforts. In moving forward from here, as we all await further regulations, we are planning a series of activities at NGA to help our state constituency. We will host a webinar on opportunity zones after the election in late 2018 or early 2019. We're planning to host an all-state summit in the spring, and we'll follow this up with a series of in-state workshops to help states build strategic plans. From those events, we'll develop model comprehensive strategies and best practices to share with states through the NGA Center. Perhaps most important to this audience, we want to reiterate that NGA will be happy to connect foundations with their governors and other appropriate state officials. We're interested in connections with community foundations, regionally oriented foundations, and those that operate at a national level. This will be important for coordinating vision and strategies so that together we can realize the maximum collective impact. And finally, we will involve your councils on foundations in our planning for the upcoming events, including the webinar, the summit, and other NGA activities. We'd like to thanks again to the council for inviting us to join you on this webinar today and to share these plans. And please feel free to follow up with either one of us. We're happy to respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally and Tim. So just a couple of quick questions before we get to our panel. Do you expect that all states will have a strategy? Are you getting a sense that everybody thinks it's important that they at least have some sort of strategy?
We certainly hope so, but we will be working both with all the states as a group and with them one-on-one individually to try to encourage them to at least look at this and consider how they might want to move forward. And I want to ask my group whether anybody wants to add anything.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I'm sort of wondering, it sounded like there were some states that had gotten really active after the designation, and then there are others that were not. I guess it's probably something like Aaron said, that, this is going to go on for a while yet. But one other question, if I may, and that is, how should foundations find out what their governors are doing, or how should they approach the states to be part of the conversation if there are conversations going on?
Well, one is through the upcoming events and convenings that we described that we're planning, and then also they can contact NGA directly, and we'll be happy to serve as an intermediary to get folks talking together and partnering together. I think that in the long run is our goal.
Okay, all right, that's great. And I would say to the council members that are on the phone, don't hesitate to get in touch with me to make that connection, and also with Sally and Tim. We're happy to kind of shepherd that through as well, since we look forward to working with you all over at the Center for Best Practices as this rolls out. So we're going to move on now, and our next set of speakers are going to share how they are approaching opportunity zones as foundations and CDFIs, and I've asked them all to give us some food for thought about what philanthropy should be thinking about as this all begins to unfold. So our first speaker is going to be Adam Northup, and he's going to discuss how Locus has been communicating with community foundations and stakeholders to see what they know. They're identifying shovel-ready projects and looking to convene stakeholders. So we're going to start with Adam.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. As I was just introduced, I'm with Locus Impact Investing. For those that don't know, Locus is part of Virginia Community Capital, which is one of the larger CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions in the U.S. And we have a national advisory and fund management set of services and products and our clients, our focus is place-based foundations. And so as both part of a CDFI and a advisory that's focused on the work that many of you do, Opportunity Zones very early on caught our interest. And we spent quite a bit of time over the last few months speaking not only with foundations and philanthropy, but with state and local government, regional government, state, regional and local economic development authorities, with a wide range of investors, some purely motivated by the financial profit opportunity, but many motivated by both the ability to deploy capital and have socially good impact. We've talked to a number of, likewise, businesses and property owners also on that spectrum. And so, and including wealth management firms, other financial institutions. So we've had a good chance to really get a read of the landscape with the intent of helping our foundation clients figure out what role they can play. And so I'm largely going to just spend a few minutes talking about the type of roles that we're working with foundations today to figure out if they can play and kind of what that looks like. But I think it's important to understand why we're arriving on that, those roles, to understand a little bit of our perspective about what's going on. And so I'm going to flip to the next slide, hopefully. Good. So here's our general perspective of kind of what's happening on the ground today that we think foundations likely need to really internalize. And I would summarize this really with kind of one with one message. There is going to be plenty of capital available to these communities. I don't think there's going to be enough projects for that capital to flow to, even in a best case scenario. And even in communities where there are good projects at the ready or on the horizon, there really is a lack of the connective tissue to match that capital to those businesses and to those investments and those developments. And so, you know, as you think about the, you know, as we've been talking about thus far, you know, the potential for, you know, this is, at least on paper, designed to help these communities generate wealth and prosperity, but without, you know, really that connective tissue from a more socially oriented perspective, you know, that market really is going to be difficult to come together. And so, you know, underneath of that general perspective, I think some of the other interesting things for this group to really internalize is, you know, there will be plenty of large urban centered real estate projects. And I think that's what we're all reading about in the news. But I think there's, you know, quite a bit of activity that could help, you know, that could happen in more rural zones, and quite a bit of activity that could happen in sectors other than real estate. And so, you know, those are also gaps that a foundation might be able to help ultimately benefit from the Opportunity Zone program. So with that in mind, I'm going to flip to the next slide, and I'm just going to talk briefly about this. But we're talking with foundations about playing kind of one of four roles, or in some cases all of them, or two of them, or three of them. And I would say, moving left to right on this slide, that role in large part depends on what a foundation is doing today in terms of place-based impact investing. If your foundation is already deploying assets into communities in in forms of equity or debt, PRIs, you know, what have you, chances are you can do more sophisticated or play more sophisticated type of roles, which would be kind of moving over to the right side of the page. But for a lot of foundations and a lot of philanthropy groups that we've been talking to, what you see in that first column is a fantastic role to play, and actually probably the most important one right now, which is really to get those communities aware of and knowledgeable of the Opportunity Zone program. I continue to go around and talk in local forums, and even just this morning I was in a community in Virginia, and one of my early questions always is, what is the level of awareness about Opportunity Zones? And it's almost always an extremely low level, meaning only what they've read about in the newspaper or blurbs. And so there is still this just tremendous need for a championing of the opportunity in these communities. And community foundations, a lot of them, as we work with them, recognize that they have a unique kind of convening power here. They have a unique ability to partner with high net worth individuals and donors who can get things moving in the community, can generate attention in the community, et cetera. And so quite a bit of the foundations we're talking to recognize that this is really a place that they want to play and are trying to figure out kind of what tactics to deploy to do that. There was a question earlier asked about, about PRIs and how this relates to Opportunity Zones. And I think that's how I think about sort of the second column here, which is Opportunity Zone. The Opportunity Zone program is really meant to be only one piece, or I think in the best situation, Opportunity Zone funds are really only one piece of the capital stack, meaning that there is, like in any project or business investment, there is probably going to be some lending done to support it. There's going to be some equity done, and maybe Opportunity Zones is only one portion of that equity investment. But there's also, in a lot of cases, philanthropy can invest alongside in terms of granting or PRIs or direct investing. And so that second column is real, at its most impactful. It's leveraging the assets, that a community foundation has pulled together to help alongside the actual for-profit investment that is taking place. I think it could also be as simple as creating space or helping to leverage institutions that foundations are already supporting to educate and to bring others up to speed, whether that's business incubators, et cetera. The third box is really where we're spending quite a bit of time right now, not just with philanthropy and foundations, but with local groups, including economic development and a government, and that is creating essentially a market. As I said, a lot of these communities don't have the ecosystem, the investment ecosystem. They haven't had an inflow of capital in any material way in some time, and so there are a lot of investors out there who would love to find places to put that investment, but there isn't a way for them to find that. Likewise, in a lot of these communities, there's often business owners or proprietors who still don't know about this opportunity as a way to potentially expand their business or start a new business. And so, creating a place to match those two interests can be a very interesting place for foundations to play. And the way you can play there is spur the creation of that. You're seeing some of that in a couple states through granting or other funding. I think more locally, we're seeing philanthropy sit at the table and help kind of figure out who needs to convene to create these markets, and helping set the agenda in terms of where the investment needs to flow, often in line with with the priorities of the foundation itself. The last thing I'll mention.
Adam, this is Jeff.
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you, but I wonder if you could just kind of quickly wrap this up so we can get to our next speakers and have a little time left for questions. So if you would, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say the last one, number 4 on the slide, is something that we have talked to a couple of foundations about doing, but really haven't seen much action there. I think that's a fairly sophisticated role to play, and a unique role for a community foundation or a foundation to play. But I think it's a role that they could play. So I'll stop there.
And so we're going to move on quickly to Aaron at the Kresge Foundation. So, Aaron.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So quickly, Kresge Foundation is a privately endowed foundation headquartered in Metro Detroit. I sit in the TRI making arm of the foundation, our social investment practice, and I'm going to talk quickly about how we are engaged in the Opportunity Zone segment, which is a lot taking off of what has been said by the other presenters. So a few months ago, we partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation to issue a call for proposals from potential opportunity fund managers. You know, the reason that we did this is we were trying to map what this new marketplace might look like. You know, our foundation is focused on creating opportunities for people with low income in America's cities. And it's not entirely clear or at all clear to us whether or not this tool is going to create opportunities, take away opportunities, or be a non-issue in the places and the communities that we care about. So we thought we'd go out into the market and see what people were thinking about for capital and how this incentive might play out in a private marketplace. That application received 140 some applicants from virtually every state across the country, from large global corporate banks all the way down to 2,500 person rural towns. And then we've had another couple dozen come in after the pipeline. So we've got a decent mapping of what potential opportunity fund managers might look like. And again, these managers are folks who would create the funds, aggregate the capital, and then invest the capital on behalf of investors into businesses and projects in opportunity zones. So that data map that we constructed led us to a path to kind of execute on what I would consider to be an influence agenda. You know, from our perspective, and I'm a bit religious about this point, but from our perspective, this is not a program. And I bristle a little bit to calling it a program because it is not like the low income housing tax credit. It's not like the historic tax credit. It's not like any other community development tool that exists today. It is not a scarce resource. It is not allocated according to some formula based on a public policy priority. There's no real control, central control mechanism in a federal bureaucracy. It is a marketplace. This is a lot closer to the home mortgage interest deduction or bonus depreciation than it is the low income housing tax credit. So in light of a new market that is being created that is designed to focus capital at low income communities, but virtually absent all guardrails and protections and statements of outcome and evaluation, you know, we're pretty concerned about what that might mean for low income communities. So we are trying to influence this market early in the hopes that we can at least prevent some of the worst abuses by creating norms and standards inside of the new marketplace that fund managers will opt into because it is the way the market works, even though they're not required to by the federal statute. We're going to go about that in a couple different ways. So out of that RFP, we have stood up a new, I'm going to call it an incubator for lack of a better term, in partnership with Rockefeller and Calvert Impact Capital. We're taking a handful of small managers that are highly aligned with our foundation goals, that are deeply embedded in, you know, racial equity and opportunity for low-income people, and you know, sort of core to community development work. They need help. They need help incubating a fund. They need a lawyer, accountant, and a capital raising strategist. They need to take their idea and they need to put it into the form of a private placement memo, and then they need to take that memo to market and see what kind of capital they can raise. It is not at all clear to me. In fact, I'm quite skeptical that this is actually going to lead to any kind of low-cost capital at scale in the near term. So the question will be, can these managers find a way to deliver their projects and priorities in a format that is appealing to this new marketplace and to these new investors? So we're going to try to help them do that by hiring that lawyer, hiring that accountant, giving them a capital raising strategy. We're going to grant fund that with Rockefeller to see if we can't get some funds stood up quickly and get them out to market on the small scale side, typically 25 million or under, very place-based. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we are working with a handful of new fund managers that are what we call capital aggregators. They're large, private fund managers. They already move hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of capital every year. They're on wealth management platforms. They are in the business of delivering capital to markets, and they are what I would call impact ambivalent for the most part. We are trying to see whether or not we can strike a deal with them and say, we will use our balance sheet and provide you a guarantee of some sort to de-risk your fund. We'll give you our name, our reputation as a good housekeeping seal of approval. And in exchange, you will agree to do things that you don't have to do inside of the federal program. We want transparency, accountability. We want some statement of outcome. We want fidelity to that outcome. And we want some data so we can evaluate whether or not this is effective beyond just financial return. So I'm in the middle of negotiating with a half a dozen larger fund managers right now to see if we can make that trade. And again, our goal is to get those managers to market, get them to market quickly, get them capitalized, and then we are going to shine a very bright light on them as an example of this is how this new marketplace needs to work. These are the principles that fund managers need to adopt if they want to be successful. And the goal is that if they are successful early, other managers may follow in that path as a market norm, right? And those responsible investing practices will set the industry on a trajectory that is more likely to help low-income people and address some of the problems that that this legislation was supposed to get at. And then in the middle, we think there's a strong need for an advocacy agenda here. Every state who has a state-level income tax on capital gains is being lobbied heavily right now to water down their state-level taxation plan to conform with the federal guidelines. We are concerned, what are you getting for that watering down? So maybe states can find a way to address the inadequacies inside of the federal legislation by demanding accountability, transparency, fidelity to outcomes, and these sorts of things that we would want to see. Maybe we can get that at the state level. We're also working on an advocacy agenda to empower groups to shine a very bright light on the worst practices that are bound to happen inside of this marketplace. So we want to be able to show where abuses are happening. So when we have a chance to relitigate this thing, we can show both the good and the bad. And so that's the strategy that we are executing on. We would love to have some help in that. We are building a vehicle where other foundations can join us and share in some guarantee risks to help influence this marketplace and these managers. And I'm happy to chat with anybody about that to the extent that they're interested. So I will stop there.
Excellent. Thank you. That is really, really interesting. I think this is reflective, Adam, of your number 4 column where you said that was going to be hard work in terms of actually setting up funds. So, and we hope that you'll keep the field also informed. Aaron would be happy to, of course, help you do that. I'm going to move on now and ask Rachel Riley to tell us about Enterprise Community Partners and what kind of observations and actions have you been taking?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I want to be cognizant of time and all the, I'm sure, multitude of questions that folks have, and also the fact that I think past 2 presenters have done an excellent job in really covering the information that I was going to share, and want to say that Locus is such a leader in this space, as well as Kresge and the great work that Aaron's been doing. The thing that I continue to say is that the early movers are going to make the market, and the capacity building that Aaron and team have done over at Kresge has been hugely impactful and will be hugely impactful in ensuring that the community development space will be able to capture a portion of this capital, because this is an economic development tool, and that's very different as far as what that looks like on terms of outcomes, and it's not ready-made for the community development space. So really, really important work. And in saying that, I do want to share some of what Enterprise Community Partners does and what we've been doing with Opportunity Zones this year. I was just trying to advance the slide. I'm not sure if I have slide control yet, or if someone, there it goes, thank you. So Enterprise Community Partners, we are a national nonprofit organization, and we, within that, have a community development financial institution and have been syndicating tax credits and investing in communities for 3 decades, in addition to policy work and having expertise with working with communities on the ground. So we were an early supporter of the Investing in Opportunity Act, and that was when the legislation had reporting requirements associated with it, and of course was the preceding legislation that had the Opportunity Zones concept in it. And so once it was passed in December, we very quickly saw a need to help inform and create the tools and resources needed for the community development space to understand what this is and what this is not, to Aaron's point. And we created mapping tools. We have been working alongside key stakeholders at both the national and local levels to help both guide how the designation process went, to help inform that, but also to flag what some of the key issues may be as far as the potential pitfalls of you know, if we don't do this correctly, here's where some unintended negative consequences may occur. And so to that end, we've been really active in talking about the need for investment transparency, and for the need to define what abuse looks like, and the fact that IRS has statutory authority to do so. So what I do want to point to is some of these resources can be found on our website, which is opportunityzonesinfo.org. So we have a number of webinars we've done, as well as blog posts. So please use that as a resource. The mapping tool, which I'll get into momentarily, has been downloaded or accessed over 100,000 times at this point. It was very heavily used during the designation process. A lot of states have provided feedback that it was very helpful during their designation process, and to the extent that, yes, it was kind of a free-for-all with some level of guidance, but not a lot. We really wanted to create a framework for states to be thoughtful about designation, since this was a 10-year window, and we knew that picking the right census tracts is going to be key to some level of effectual investment of this capital. We also have local expertise in a lot of these communities, just given the nature of our work, and so we have an understanding of what the need is in this community and how financing in these communities work. So to the point around what does the need for multiple sources of capital and blended capital financing, and what does the capital stack look like for investing in distressed communities, we very much have that expertise. And our financing capabilities, really what our Opportunity Fund strategy is around creating our own funds, but also where others want to create high impact funds, we want to be able to backfill and support funds in partnership where we have core competencies to help promote this sector, because we think that the more opportunities investors have to place capital in highly impactful funds, that just helps create a robust marketplace of opportunities and options, because the policy is very important, but if we don't have the optionality for investors to place capital in product, then the capital is not going to get deployed into these activities that we all want to see occur. I'm sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide again. Okay. So the other thing that I want to note is the mapping tool, which, and thanks to Kresge, who through funding helped support the second iteration of our mapping tool, which is now called Opportunities Zone Explorer, which is a free Explorer tool where folks can go on and understand what the characteristics are for every opportunity zone in the nation now. This is highly useful because absent any mandate around impact reporting, I think it's very important for funds that want to do this to go in and prior to investment baseline and then continue to benchmark how communities are evolving and changing with those investments. And with every census tract, we now have the ability for anyone to go and pull these 25-page reports, which have a bunch of data that is very useful and is provided in the framework of opportunity. So what does opportunity look like for people living in these communities on a number of different metrics and paradigms? So this can be very helpful as well for data-driven policy solutions. So to the extent folks are concerned about the risk of displacement in opportunity zones, it'll be very helpful to understand whether or not residents face housing shock, whether there's affordable housing stock in your communities prior to creating any sort of approach to what housing resources may need to be directed into communities. So that's just one example, but there's a number of different ways that this could be very applicable for investors, for policymakers, for fund managers, et cetera, to really understand what the characteristics of these zones are. So again, that's on opportunityzonesinfo.org, free 25-page reports for every opportunity zone in the nation. And then ways that philanthropy should engage. I think a lot of these have already been mentioned. The one thing that I do want to note is really the important role that I see community foundations potentially playing with their, with not donor advised funds specifically, but that group of investors, because it's not necessarily the donor advised fund that's the vehicle for investment, but there's a real, the folks that have donor advised funds are people who very likely could be investors into local opportunity funds because they, number one, have made the choice to create a donor advised fund at a local community foundation as opposed to putting it on a private wealth management platform on Wall Street, and also have the ability to create a donor advised fund. And so I think that there's a real role that community foundations can play in educating those folks and convening local investor base and potential fund managers. And also with capacity building and technical assistance, I know states are looking at how they're granting to help support local plans for opportunity zones and local community fund managers. But I think that there's a real opportunity for philanthropy to match those dollars in really interesting ways. So that may be something to potentially explore as well. With all that said, I think that that everyone else covered a lot of this, so I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. And that's how you can get a hold of Rachel. Kelsey, could you push forward? I want to show a couple of slides here. So I've come across a couple of tools and resources that I think are useful. When we send the slides out, you can link, they'll be in there, and you can go to them directly through the links. But the National Council of State Housing Agencies issued a press release, I don't know, a week or two ago, and they have developed an Opportunity Zone Fund directory. It's one of the first directories that I found that really lists funds. So I put that link in there. I have been in communication with them, and they are very happy to have conversations with foundations. They think that there are opportunities there, particularly around affordable housing. They would love to hear from philanthropy as well. St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank has an Opportunity Zone Explorer interactive data tool, and it measures the displacement risk in opportunity zones. And one of the staff there in their community development department that we've been talking to is more than happy to work with any foundations that would like to use that tool or understand that tool if you have any difficulty trying to figure it out. Michael Eggleston is more than happy to help. And then a recent blog that we have posted that the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance has written, John Cochran, who is a staff person there, on community foundations specifically, and references how community foundations could help make the most of opportunity zones. And you can find that on the council's blog spot. You want to push ahead one more? So one other thing that we're going to be doing as a follow-along to this is to have a webinar, which will be a primer really for funders, on CDFIs. And opportunity zones will be one of the focus areas, but also we wanted to build the knowledge base based on feedback that we received from our inclusive economic prosperity summits about more conversation between CDFIs and place-based foundations, particularly community foundations. And so we will be hosting with Donna Fabiani, who is at the Opportunity Finance Network, who's going to be leading a primer for funders on December 12th. And you will get information about how to register for that. That will be up on our site here within the next week or so. And I think, after that, I think one more slide in, Kelsey. No. Yes? Okay. I think if you come across tools and resources that you would like us to post, the council is developing a web page on opportunity zones that we hope will develop into some sort of a clearinghouse for foundations as we go forward on all this, so don't hesitate to send that to us. And we're coming down to the end of our time. We do have a few more minutes. Are there any questions that have popped up? Any hands up? If there's anyone that would like to ask a question, please raise the hand in the chat box. And I would ask that if there are our presenters, are there any questions that you'd like to pose to each other while you're on the line too? So you get to ask questions as well. And we're just checking to see if there's any hands up. So I'm going to take advantage of this then and ask. I'd like to ask Aaron at the Kresge Foundation. Aaron, are you still on?
I am.
Aaron, so this is pretty interesting work that you are going to be doing with Rockefeller, and just wondering, do you have any vision for how you will keep the field informed about your progress that you're making and the insights that you're learning? Any guidance that you might push out as foundations are thinking about how to do this kind of engagement?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to do a lot of qualitative stuff and then potentially some quantitative stuff. I mean, we're going to continue to publish on our own internal blog, which is called Mission Money Markets, on our website. So as we progress, like insights that we're learning from these negotiations, both with large fund managers and the incubation of small managers, and sort of, how successful that is. And, we're also spending a tremendous amount of time with investors right now and ultra high net worth individuals. So we're going to try to culminate a piece around what we think the investor market is really looking for. So that'll be a future post. On the quantitative side, it will depend on how successful we are in negotiating with these managers and extracting data collection and dissemination. One of the troubles, maybe somebody could go on mute. A lot of feedback on that. So our hope is that we get enough data to do some evaluation. We've been working with some think tanks around what is the data that we would like to collect to know whether or not we're actually advancing the ball beyond just flows of capital, right? Capital flows in low-income communities all the time. It's just usually extractive. So we want to know if we're making a difference, particularly below the population level into subgroups, as to whether or not capital flows are actually addressing things like social and economic mobility, economic inequality, if this is becoming an impact investing tool, are investors trading this tax benefit for yield, or are they taking all of the yield and still getting a market rate return? That kind of qualitative stuff is really going to be in the details of the fund structures that we negotiate and if we're successful with anybody. So my hope is that we'll have more to share, but it's too early to say.
Great, thank you very much. Not seeing any other hands raised in the chat box, so no other questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to having you join us in future conversations about opportunity zones. Please don't hesitate to let Peter Gordon or myself know what you're doing, what kinds of impediments, what kinds of challenges that you might be encountering, things that you're hearing in your communities as this new unprecedented investment opportunity starts to unfold. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a pleasant rest of the afternoon.